Hi, welcome to Silent Generation. I'm Joseph.
I'm Nathan.
And today we are joined by Will, who runs Brick of Chicago, a Chicago-based tour that centers around bricks and the stories they tell.
Hi, guys. Thanks for having me.
Tell us briefly about, Brick of Chicago, how you started doing this, how you got here.
Yeah, so I'll start with Brick of Chicago today is I lead tours, 10 different neighborhoods around Chicago.
Wow.
As far north as Rogers Park, as far south as Beverly, and everywhere in between. And the tours sort of start from a place of, if I can convince you that a brick is an interesting thing, I can get you excited about anything. Yeah. So they start with brick, but they go to, public policy history and quirky neighborhood stories and all the sort of things that surround us that you might not notice, but that there's so much interesting stuff around. And then it's also my Instagram, an Instagram account I run where I post pictures of bricks almost daily at this point. After having a child, I don't quite post
Understandable.
as daily as I used to. But it started as an accident. It really did. I moved to Chicago from St. Paul, Minnesota, where I grew up, to teach theater. I moved here to be a theater teacher, and my first job was running a middle school theater camp. And that's my training. I went to college for theater. But I'd always been raised with a love of architecture. My dad's grandfather had been an architecture journalist. And so it was something I paid a lot of attention to as I was teaching these after-school classes all over the city and all over the suburbs. So as I would travel, I would just, try to take time to notice what was around me. And that was aided by a wonderful book called On Looking by the writer Alexandra Horwitz, where she takes, I think it's 15 different walks around New York City with different experts and tries to see the world through their eyes. And they're experts like an urban bug expert or, a sign painter or her, 2-year-old.
I like that.
And it was great. And I thought, well, let me start looking at things. What do I see? And I noticed bricks. I noticed that, here in Chicago, especially coming from St. Paul, this place is huge. And my first class I taught after school, I was living in Andersonville, and the class was in Beverly.
Yeah, wow.
So I was really seeing two totally different sides of the city all the time.
Yeah.
And you notice that the thing that unifies it is brick, and the thing that diversifies the city is brick, is that you get the exact same building repeated over and over and over again. But the brick is what is different, to break kayfabe. We're recording in a 2-flat in Avondale. And, this got a boxy front. Imagine probably built around 1915, but it doesn't look like, the one exactly next to it or the one across the street from it, because this one has a beautiful iron spot, what's called scratch and smooth brick on it. The one next door doesn't. It's got something else. And they look different. And they don't look like red rectangles is the other thing.
Yeah.
It's like, well, a brick's red. And so I started taking pictures, and summer of 2016 in the basement of Northlight Theater in Skokie, I started an Instagram account, and enough people started following and asking me questions. And I think what's kept me going and has kept people coming back to it is that I come from this from outside.
Yeah.
I'm not here to tell you everything I know and get you to learn everything. My job has always been to try to make you excited about things. And so that I see as my job in Brick of Chicago is to introduce you to the built world around you and make you interested to start asking more.
Yeah. It's in a very nice and disarming way.
Yeah.
I think that even if you sign up to go on a Chicago Architecture Center tour, I think that even has a little bit of not intimidation to it, but it's oh, this is going to be very
it could feel very official. It could feel very official.
Exactly.
Let me say I love those. They do wonderful work.
Yeah,
if you haven't been on the boat, go on the boat.
Oh yeah.
We actually haven't mentioned the title of the episode yet. It's Vernacular Architecture. This is a little bit of a tangent from what you typically talk about. We're talking about things in addition to bricks, but it's going to be an interesting episode.
Yeah, I think I'm very excited about it because, one of the things that this project has allowed me to do is basically find good in all design, all eras. It's totally disabused me of the idea of we don't make them like we used to.
Oh, wow.
This idea that the best design is of the past and today we only make, crap. It's just not true.
Yeah, I mean, I have a personal investment in it because someone who builds. So it's oh, geez, I hope we don't just build crap.
Listen, some people do. Some people do build crap, but they also used to build crap too.
Yeah.
It's not unique to our era.
It's a survivorship bias. We just see the good ones left over.
And it's nostalgia. And so I'm really excited to talk about vernacular architecture because there is, as I've been thinking about it and reading about it, You know, like the idea of what is it and who gets to decide is such an interesting thing to me.
Yeah.
And I have such a love of all these different types.
Yeah. We're excited to like dive in deep on something with you because, like as you said, you have to make your tours pretty approachable to people. And we'll try and stay approachable on this, of course. We can also dive in some ways.
I wanted to ask you. So I personally, I've been on 4 tours: Noble Square, Bronzeville, Beverly, and Uptown. And you mentioned on previous tours that you kind of try to do a new one each year. Do you have one that you're trying to debut currently?
I do in July. I'll be premiering a brand new one, which is going to be my first ever bike tour of Oak Park and Austin.
Oh, cool.
Which I'm really excited for because those are, you talk about vernacular architecture, they share a very similar architectural language because they share very similar history. Starting as part of the same village with Oak Park, Austin, Berwyn, and Cicero until Austin was kicked out and given to Chicago because the Austinites controlled the government and the rest of the town sort of rebelled. But then they are so architecturally similar and have a lot of this shared history up until, the 60s when the city, the power, the money just pulls out of Austin. And then it just gets kind of ignored in many ways after that by people from outside the neighborhood. So I'm very excited to find the connections between the two of them. People have often asked, like, would you do an Oak Park tour? And I feel like to do an Oak Park tour, there's already so much coverage there.
Yeah.
So I try with my tours to find things where I can either put a new angle on it or introduce a part of the city or a narrative that they might otherwise not.
Yeah, that's exciting that you're going to be doing the Austin tour because for me as like a native Chicagoan, the tours that you do that bring me out to different parts of the city that I've never been to before are the most interesting. Yeah. Like I've been to Bronzeville and Beverly through your tours for the first time. And the city is just so big, and getting this sort of like anti-essentialist view of how different each neighborhood can be is really cool.
But at the same time, there's threads that connect them all.
Yeah.
And that's another really interesting thing about looking at the city specifically through a lens of brick architecture is you see parallels in places, the same type of brick, smooth red brick that's being used to build Pullman is also being used to build Pilsen and Lincoln Park. Different types of buildings, but it's the same material. And you see these sort of rings and pockets that move out and reflect each other.
Yeah.
It's like, it's funny that thing of like every neighborhood wants to believe it's fully unique. And it's like, you're kind of part of the broader story here.
You're part of the broader story.
You are unique, but like
you're being influenced by, when you talk vernacular architecture, you're being influenced by, the influence of prominent architecture, but also of what, the people in your neighborhood want, but also what developers think you want citywide. And I think today, especially, that architecture is really driven more by, is so much more citywide because there's just less space than there used to be.
Yeah.
But anyway, we'll get into
Do you have
that.
a favorite neighborhood in the city?
It changes a lot, and I love all my children equally.
Yes.
But I would say, honestly, pretty consistently, I would say Chatham.
Wow.
Oh, cool.
Far South Side, like 190th to like 110th, MLK, Michigan, Indiana, Cottage Grove. It is a neighborhood that was pretty sparsely populated in the interwar years. You got some 2 flats, 3 flats, some bungalows, and then a huge mid-century boom in building, especially then in the 1960s when it became this sort of nexus of the black middle class. And so you have a lot of these developer-driven buildings, but also some very cool custom-designed modernist homes. And the lawns are very large. It feels so Chicago, but so out of Chicago.
Yeah.
And my favorite donut shop is there. So Dat Donut, check it out in Cottage Grove.
Yeah. Was Chatham like affected at all during urban renewal, or is it pretty well preserved?
No, not really. It saw some wartime public housing developments, Chatham Gardens on Cottage Grove, but it did not really see any demolition because it was still being built up at the time that urban renewal was cutting down other parts of the city.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So now I think we can start to get into today's topic, vernacular architecture. It's good to start out with what it is. So the Occam's razor definition is it's architecture without architects, but I think that's a bit too simple because if that's your definition, then like 98% of the homes being built today are vernacular architecture, which is a crazy number that only 2% are being built with licensed architects.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was kind of crazy to read that stat. Especially as an architecture historian, because so much of what gets written down is things written down by architects, that I think it's a good reminder from a historiographic perspective that, there's a lot happening out there that's not necessarily recorded in the same way, in journals, that it is with architects.
Yeah, because when I think of vernacular architecture, I picture Brazil in my head a lot. I've been there twice. I have this like really big affinity for Brazilian culture. And so what I picture is a bit closer to informal housing, what you see in favelas, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
But America has a deep tradition with vernacular architecture, in part because building in rural areas, it's always a bit more lax and loose. Like you can build a barn or like a shed in your backyard if you're like on a farm and no one really cares. Whereas if you're in a city, it's much more regulated. So America being a newer country that's more spread out, we actually had more of it than I realized.
Yeah. And I think, especially in America too, it becomes a really important piece of identity. Both this idea of we can kind of do whatever we want and we can build and problem solve in all these different ways that then become part of our shared heritage. One of my favorite examples is in colonial architecture, colonial revival style, there's the garrison house form, which is a 2-story building where the second floor sticks out over the first floor. And it's sort of 2 flat fronts. And we do that in colonial revival architecture because we're copying colonial architecture.
Yeah.
Why did they do it in colonial architecture? We don't know. We don't know.
It just got stuck
They
in
did
there.
it, and
Like sometimes things just get wedged in and it's like, well, this is how we do it.
And nowadays when we build it, we want to build part of this American vernacular vocabulary. And so we do that, even if we don't quite understand why.
Sometimes vernacular architecture gets held up as like, oh, they're accessing some part of their brain or their culture and they were devising these like perfect solutions to local problems. I think that's a little like overly kind to it. Like there's a lot that goes into this that isn't just like raw, efficient problem solving. Like people carry in just like little holdovers, kind of vestigial bits of the cultures they came from.
I was thinking as I was preparing for this, I think a thing that defines vernacular architecture for me is that it can be changed. It's not precious in a certain way, where like the Roby House is not a piece of vernacular architecture. It's a monument in many ways.
Yeah.
But like this building, you could pop up another floor on it. You build up the back, you could do something to the interior. And that, you're working within these forms that can then be changed over time and still retain, their quality. It's not as precious, I guess.
And when like vernacular architecture, like when it does get noticed and it's like, oh my God, this is a great example of this style and we have to protect this, it gets protected and it gets frozen.
Yes.
Where probably like if this is a building that gets, protected and frozen in 1970, it was probably, if it was continually lived in, it was changed throughout time. Someone stuck like an arts and craft facade on it in the 1910s or something. But then now we call it basically and we cut it off.
I mean, connecting that to my tours, that is the story of Old Town. Old Town is a neighborhood that was really built up in the immediate post-Great Fire years by these German immigrants with a lot of influx of new wealth. And they're building these workers' cottages, these brick flats, these, townhomes that then become apartments over time and affordable places that get added on. It becomes this place that artists want to move to because there's not really the rules and the buildings aren't precious.
Yeah.
But then the people who follow them find the buildings incredibly precious. And what we get today is a neighborhood that is just frozen in time, in one particular time, its earliest time, and it's impossible to change any of it and impossible to get in there without $2.5 million.
Yeah. No, I found a strange rental 7-story building that I was living in there. And I'm like, oh, this is incorrect. Like I shouldn't be here in Old Town. Like I'm the only not millionaire around here.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and they don't want any more towers to be built. So
yes. Ooh, that was a pet peeve of mine.
Yeah, they could keep it pure. I love to, tie in my tours. I give them a Kinley Park tour, and the way I try to encourage people to take that tour, because it's a neighborhood a lot of people don't know.
Yeah.
It's Old Town if the yuppies never made it there. You know, you see a lot of the same vernacular architecture, but it just has people living in it.
Yeah, if beatniks never came there in the 50s, followed by hippies in the 60s, and that
and
whole kind of thing.
Reaganites afterwards. Yeah, it's just people living in them, and these buildings are there and changing and sort of bear the symbols of their entire history.
Interesting.
Yeah, as you're saying, it's like with a building that might have, say, been built by a licensed architect, if even one person comes along and makes, changes to the facade, it then can look vernacular to us.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, vernacular architecture is like it has so much say of just either the homeowner or the contractor. It's like even if there was an architect involved in some portion of it, like it's vernacular when it's like, I don't know, the architect is maybe covered in some ways or like twisted.
I can actually give you an interesting example of sort of a twist of this in that I live in a vernacular architecture home. I live in an American Foursquare built by a developer in 1905 on a block of the same Foursquare where each one you could pick your different little fixtures. And so there was no architect involved. And a lot of the interior fixtures we found are from catalogs. Now in 2025, we're expanding it and we've hired an architect to do it so that we can, as closely as possible, mimic the vernacular.
That's so hiring someone professional who's like studied this. Like, all right, now try and imitate what a housewife would have picked from a catalog in
1905. Yeah, and it truly is. And like, in a way that if I just went to a developer, if I went to Air Room, I don't think it would be possible. It's sort of the sort of thing that seems like it oftentimes now requires an architect to work on historic vernacular architecture.
Yeah. There's, I shouldn't be that surprised, but there's a surprising degree of like academic work that goes around vernacular architecture as a field. Like I found this really cool book called Out of the Loop, and it was from the Vernacular Architecture Forum. I think they held their conference here in 2015, but it started out with them saying actually that it was rare for them to do their conferences in cities, that they typically go to rural areas like Michigan, Massachusetts, where there are farmhouses and they study those. But yeah, like there are people who study this for a living.
Yeah.
And there's been different waves of the kind of general opinion of it. So like in the early 1900s, from my understanding, like vernacular architecture was dismissed. It was seen as like a lower base form that people need to separate themselves from. And then post-war, there was kind of a very generous critical eye given to it of kind of what I said earlier, like this is the pure form. They're getting at something that we've all been distracted by, like study. And then now, since the 90s or so, people have arrived at a more balanced view that like there's lessons to be told. Like vernacular architecture tells you a lot about the people who made it. It can teach you things about like adapting to your environment, but it's not this perfect cure-all either.
It tells you how people use buildings in different times. There's a great book called Houses Without Names that is an attempt to quantify and qualify what vernacular architecture is. And he ends up deciding, the author whose name I can't remember right now, that you have to look at the floor plan of these buildings. Are they giving the kitchen primacy? Are they giving the living space primacy? And one thing I really appreciate about that is that it treats things like a McMansion as vernacular architecture.
I didn't put that in the docket, but I was going to. I was kicking.
And like that's a place where you have the foyer. Is
lawyer
such a,
foyer.
Yeah, exactly. The lawyer foyer. Yeah, you have the private room with the piano. You have, it's all of these things are based on their use and how you want to be perceived. But I think I want to push back against your previous statement in that I think an interesting thing when you look at how people approach architecture, at the turn of the century, we get things like arts and crafts.
Oh, yeah. Well, that was
Which is an interesting thing where you can wonder, is it vernacular or is it architects and academics trying to copy the vernacular? By creating these things that are handmade, but they're doing it in these handmade ways in the old ways. And you get like arts and crafts bungalows across Chicago. Are they a Chicago vernacular or are they an imposition of a English type of vernacular? And then I think in the post-war years, you get, in Chicago at least, a rejection of the vernacular on a developer level, on a citywide level, where the vernacular becomes the workers' cottage, the two flat. It's dark, it's old, it's sooty, And now
we are a modern people. We're a
modern
clean,
people.
streamlined.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and it's not enough to just, remove a building. It's to clear out whole
clean it.
swaths of these shacks that were designed with that architects, replace them with these campuses designed by
international architects.
These very rigorous mathematical principles.
Yeah.
And so, that I think gives credence to the idea of, the amateur versus the professional. Mm-hmm. And then I think postmodernism in the 70s and 80s reintroduces the idea of vernacular and sort of marries the two together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I can see how architects started to like it, because vernacular architecture oftentimes is accidentally energy efficient. These methods might have been developed by cultures who didn't have a concept of how much electricity they needed to save, but it accidentally works really well.
Yes. Yeah. And that's what from a brick perspective, that's a huge shift in the 1970s, where you see a lot of modernist buildings, very steel forward, glass forward. Then suddenly at the same time, you get this shift of people feeling like, well, we're too exposed. We need to be a little more enclosed. And you get oil embargoes, energy crisis.
Yeah.
We're losing everything through these single pane windows.
Yeah.
We need to be efficient, and we get these more historically inspired brick buildings because they feel more familiar after an age of glass, and they're also more efficient.
Yeah. Yeah. Also 70s shingle modernism.
Yeah.
That kind of thing could be from that period too.
Very much.
Yeah. And I think it's important to note we're largely just going to be discussing American vernacular architecture in today's episode. It's a rich topic. Yeah. You can go and learn about vernacular traditions all across the globe, things like igloos, half timbering. There are cave dwellings across many different cultures. But we don't want to sound too much like National Geographic. We're going to keep it a bit more local, especially because just so much about Chicago.
Yeah, keep it in our wheelhouse.
And we're encouraging you to go visit these places. And the best way to learn is by seeing.
Oh, yeah.
And take us with you.
And on that, so now we can kind of start to get into local vernacular building materials. And I want to start out with Chicago Common Brick.
So Chicago Common Brick is the brick that built Chicago. To understand what is Chicago Common Brick, first you have to understand that there's two categories of brick when we talk about brick. When you look at the front of a building, you see a brick on it. That's called face brick. It's nice brick. It's selected particularly to follow a fashion and look a particular way. For example, I can look at this 2-flat and look at that iron spot, scratch and smooth brick, which is a brick that is rough in the middle, but smooth on the sides. So you get sort of a chessboard pattern. And I can tell that this building was probably built in the 1910s because that's when that was popular. That common brick is the name for the type of brick that actually holds the building up. That's when you rip open a plaster wall. That's the brick there. It's also in Chicago, the brick you see on the side and the backs and the guts of your building. Chicago is so unique because we produced more brick and only common brick than anywhere else in the country. Yeah. Anytime you look at face brick on a building in Chicago, 95% of the time, you're looking at brick from somewhere else. Most of these brick buildings are made up of brick made locally in Chicago in these big clay pits, mostly around the river, made in the billions of bricks a year for 150 years almost. At one point, by 1916, 11% of all the brick in the entire United States made that year was Chicago Common Brick.
That's crazy.
Oh my God.
And the amazing thing about
that's just common, right? That's not even any of the face brick or anything.
Well, it's Chicago Common Brick compared to every other kind of brick. Crazy. All common face brick combined. And you see that massive numbers. And what makes it such an interesting material is no one else was interested in it. Other cities had their own common brick, and they found Chicago's common brick to be just the ugliest looking brick in the entire world. They didn't want it. But we were building at such this massive rate here.
We weren't being picky.
Yeah, that we were happy to, cheap out and just hide it a little bit. So it really is. The best quote to describe it is from the Chicago Tribune in 1912, where they wrote that Chicago is a city built mostly of itself.
Yeah,
which is such a beautiful
scraping the ground and stacking it up
scraping the ground and burning it and building our buildings out of it.
Oh, that's so good.
Something I learned from one of your tours is that the reason why there was so much clay to make bricks out of is because of the shoreline of Lake Michigan being further inland 10,000 years ago, right?
Yeah, exactly. What is now Lake Michigan used to be Lake Chicago, and it covered pretty much out to, Naperville. And still water is great for letting clay and silt and sand settle. and it settled all over dry land, what's now dry land. And so it was really easy to make brick here, really easy to make brick, because also that mixture that was deposited was a perfect mixture for making bricks. They didn't have to, sometimes you have to take clay. You can't just burn raw clay. It's going to be too brittle. You have to put additives in it. But here, the clay was almost pretty much exactly ready for the making. And so we were in a perfect position to just make a boatload of bricks.
That sounds divine.
I know.
That sounds like we were always meant to have Chicago. It was just like the world was waiting for it.
Well, to that point, one of the things I write about in my upcoming book is that Chicago burned in 1891, and how lucky we are that happened, because we were in this position to rebuild with brick, and also at a time in mechanization, the history of mechanization, where we could, for the first time, we were the first city that could really rebuild at a massive scale with brick, because we had the machines to do it.
Yeah. Wow. And can you talk a little bit about the common brick in other cities, like, say, Milwaukee or St. Louis?
Sure. Yeah. So one of the things I love about brick is it's so local to whatever is just in the clay where you are. And so while here in Chicago, the clay is full of really variable levels of mineral and stones and pebbles, and that's what makes it look so messy and weird. You go just up to Milwaukee, and there they have a beautiful, smooth, sort of deep red clay that burns to these very perfect, smooth, kind of chalky yellow bricks, and they called them Cream City bricks. And they were really popular in early Chicago because brick's heavy, it's not that far away, and it looks so much nicer in their mind too. And then you go to Madison, and there they produce common bricks that were kind of a silvery color. You go down to St. Louis. There, the bricks were very nice and red and smooth. Same thing with Philadelphia. I was in Philadelphia late last year, and it's amazing seeing buildings there because you still see the common versus face brick. They don't really look that different, the common, because the common brick was pretty nice clay to start with. And then the face brick, they really don't have to do much to it to make it even nicer.
Yeah, it can be pretty jarring in Chicago, especially when you have a stone facade and it just ends on the
hugely
corner.
So. And to besmirch architects, a lot of architects hated it. Louis Sullivan wrote about, called it shirt front buildings. That this idea that they're ugly because they're sort of hiding their true nature.
Yeah. So this is an opinion. I don't know if this is true. I go to Milwaukee. They don't have that much Cream City brick left. Like, when you go there, do you feel like you see a lot of it?
Kind of, but I have a disease.
You can see it, attuned to it. You can sense it through walls.
but also no. They stopped making it in 1920, in large part because of Chicago, because Chicago outproduced them, and their demand fell off. Chicago loved Cream City bricks in the early days of the city, but fashion started to change, and we just changed where we imported our bricks from. And then at a certain point, Milwaukee even started to import Chicago bricks because they were so cheap. If you were to come to back to Chicago in the years before and even after the fire, you would see a ton of Cream City brick around here. But as it went out of fashion, we tore it down. Similar thing in Milwaukee. I don't know for sure, but I imagine they went through a similar thing where those old buildings, especially when you look at what I find so interesting about visiting Milwaukee is it feels like they built a lot bigger, a lot earlier than Chicago, and then kind of stopped. You
see they're frozen in a different, like a decade off.
Yeah, a little bit. You go to the Third Ward there, and you see these beautiful sort of Germanic-inspired, crenellated, castle-y buildings covered in Cream City brick, and they're sort of much bigger than you would see sometimes of that same style here in Chicago. But then you don't see the later things that Chicago built in larger, bigger.
I always call those chunks of big growth in Chicago like growth rings, like on a tree. Of like we have like the kind of 1890s one. Right?
The city basically did the majority of its growing between 1870 to 1895, and then we had a recession,
first ring,
a panic they called it back then, and then from 1900 until 1930, and that's when the city just exploded, and it is cool. Chicago is so cool because it's so big. You do see these rings where you get people moving into the center, and then the city slowly expands. One of my favorite books I found at a used bookstore last year was the 1939 WPA Land Use Survey of Chicago, which just records every single block, even. And one of the things is you see these neighborhoods like Portage Park in 1939 was one of the most populous neighborhoods in the entire city because it had been developed, 10, 15 years earlier with these single family homes in huge developer tracks, and people moved in enormous numbers out there to leave apartments to move into these homes. Today there's still a lot of people live in Portage Park, but you don't think of Portage Park as having this primacy anymore.
Every neighborhood has its day in the sun.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
That always happens.
And every neighborhood still has a sun in it that you just go there and see it.
Yeah. And as much as I hate to admit it, Chicago has such a strong single family home history, versus other more Eastern, legacy streetcar cities and stuff. Like Nathan, you posted this we have a Discord for our podcast. And because Chicago came of age alongside the railroad, we were able to sprawl a little bit more, and working people could have single family homes. I mean, maybe multiple families would be living in there or whatever, but I think that's why we get vernacular homes that are still around more so than the East Coast.
Yeah, that's something I encountered in the Out of the Loop book. They described where the city's motto, Urbs in Horto, City in a Garden, came from. It's because we developed at what were at the time historically low population densities, and we had gardens and backyards and things like that, which would have not been seen in Europe and older cities at the time.
And alleys. We have alleys.
God, we love our alleys.
To take care of our garbage, but at the same time, we're not Omaha, for example. Again, when I visited Omaha, I was shocked at how sort of spread apart so much things were. It's a city that, as it sort of tried to redevelop in the mid-century, focused around the car. In a way that Chicago has some focus to the car, perhaps too much in places, but not so much that it's all, spread out like Phoenix or something like that. But also not smushed in there in a way like Boston. With the wandering paths.
We're our own thing when it comes to that. Yeah,
it's we're also just a flat pancake.
We have,
in a way where I love visiting Pittsburgh, because Pittsburgh, you see a lot of similar sort of eras and architectural styles, but it's built in these pockets and hills where they can. Where here we just could go and go and go and go.
It's East and Midwest, an interesting mix. When I feel like we're so firmly Midwest.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. Oh, I guess we were talking about different materials and stuff.
We were talking about materials.
Yeah. So the next one is limestone.
Yeah.
So this material, you see it above the doorways and windows. They're the headers or lintels. I learned what these were actually called through your tours. But growing up in Ravenswood Gardens, that you don't really see that there. You have to go pretty close to downtown before you start seeing buildings like that.
Yeah, it's called in Bedford limestone. It's from Bedford, Indiana. It's the smooth gray stone, and it's all over Chicago. It's all over the rest of the country too, because it's this really easy stone to work with. That's really very, very durable.
Yeah.
And so, in a place like Ravenswood Garden, you'll see it as windowsills, you'll see it as lintels, you'll see it as, some little details, but that's mostly a brick area. Where then, as you get to the boulevards, you get gray stones, fully clad entirely in this gray limestone. And then you get, especially in the Art Deco period, towers like the Tribune Tower or, a lot of the Empire State Building is clad in this Bedford limestone because it's this very beautiful, smooth, even material.
Yeah. I want to clarify what graystone means for our audience.
Yeah.
So in Chicago, graystone, there are around 30,000 of them in the city. They're the Chicago equivalent of brownstones in New York. So very, very high quality, almost automatically $1 million if you're in a nice neighborhood. And they we've talked about them before. They're very fire resistant too. They really hold up.
Yeah, they're great quality. And, because this limestone is so durable and, they were made so solid.
Yeah.
Interesting, tying the material though, interesting to this idea of the vernacular architecture is someone who's visiting around town asked me on a tour recently as we're talking about a graystone. They're like, but isn't this a brownstone? And I had to say, well, kind of, brownstone is a particular type of stone from Connecticut that was used to clad these buildings in Brooklyn, but it has also come to mean that kind of building
form
as well, that vernacular kind of building. And so a Chicago graystone is also kind of a brownstone in that way.
Yeah. It feels like the same evolutionary need for that in that environment,
But then we can get into the intricacies of, the brownstones are attached. In Chicago, we have the fire break in between and, blah, 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 blah. But
we'll have to have our little gangways.
Yes, you can get as divergent or as connected as you want.
Yeah. Here, the gravestones, they're in a Richardsonian Romanesque style, so they look particularly castle-like.
Yeah, it's a really versatile material, and so you get these Richardsonian, these Romanesque buildings where, especially after the fire of 1871, it makes for these rough-faced blocks that just look so permanent and heavy.
Yeah.
But then at the same time, in the classical revival, it can become these sleek, slender columns. In the Art Deco period, it can become these soft reliefs, and it's still quarried and used today.
Yeah. And then I wanted to talk about something called Chicago Greenstone. It's serpentine. I learned about this through one of the books read for this week. I walked by this building with Joseph, within the last year. It's called the Raleigh Building.
On Dearborn.
Yeah. I saw it and I turned to him and I was like, what is that?
Yeah.
Because you can tell it's like naturally green stone. I've never seen it before like this year.
Yeah, it's one of the most beautiful looking stones in the world. It's a rich sort of verdant green with these slightly lighter bands that trace through it. It's not native to Chicago, it's native to Pennsylvania. And so you see in a lot of vernacular architecture there, a lot of barns, a lot of buildings. The University of Pennsylvania.
When I was looking it up, I saw that like they have a lot of buildings made out of that, and they're hard to take care of.
The reality is the buildings look like they're made of it, but they're not anymore. Because greenstone is unfortunately a terrible building stone. It's so open, so porous. You'll see on that Raleigh Hotel, the whole top has been replaced of the building.
Yeah,
and sections
with
of
stucco, with green stucco
exactly.
on top of it, and I'm like, oh man, I hope they only did that because they really had to.
The truth is that they did, and they could have spent a lot more money to make a facsimile. But the old main at University of Pennsylvania has been replaced entirely with concrete cast to look like that stone. And you go to a greenstone church in Pullman, is just suffering and suffering because it's all made of that soft stone and just water gets in there.
Yeah. It's too bad because it is pretty.
It is.
You don't see it often in part because it fell out of popularity after the World's Fair in 1993 because the White City popularized less colorful building materials.
The clean look, yeah.
No, it probably gave the gray stones a boost and then the green stones not.
And in Louis Sullivan's words, set architecture back 100 years.
Yeah. That's what it was. We did an episode on World's Fairs, and we talked about that, of how there was like a nascent kind of movement away from historical reference and towards the earliest thing you could call modernism, basically. And then just like, nope, never mind. It's Beaux Arts from here, everyone. Like,
it's because now we're an American empire and we're, continuing the lineage.
Yeah. And then, did you want to do terracotta or
Oh, yeah. This is a semi-local kind of material, but terracotta ornament.
Yeah.
This is something like more like face brick, where you just buy it from
purely
the train line, basically.
Yeah, you bought it out of a catalog. You could be custom. It could be custom designed by an architect, but for vernacular buildings, for apartment buildings, homes, you bought it out of a catalog. And the companies putting out these catalogs were companies like the Midland Terracotta Company in Cicero, the American Terracotta Company in Crystal Lake, northwest town, and then the Northwestern Terracotta Company in Lincoln Park, right off of Clybourne, by where
we're very local. Wow.
Yeah, where I think it's the Menards is now. That's where their plant was, because Lincoln Park used to be really hard scrapple and working class. And the wonderful thing about that is you will find then the same designs all over the city. Sometimes the whole exact same building, but oftentimes more these medallions, these details. And some of them seem very local to Chicago. Others I've seen around the country,
Yeah.
It's funny, we use that term like, what is it? Richardsonian Romanesque.
Yeah.
But there's also like
Sullivan-esque,
that one. And it's like that kind of, it's the part of like capital A architecture that drips down into vernacular architecture, where like a local guy building a pharmacy on a street corner is like, well, I can't really afford Louis Sullivan, but I can buy
towards the
from
end of
the
his
Midland
career,
catalog.
He probably could, but you didn't want to hire him. But you can get that same, terracotta allowed for the grandeur, the decoration of architect designed buildings to be brought to everyday buildings of any and every kind. It also, from a vernacular, helped establish vernaculars. Specifically, there's a pair of architects, Michelson and Rogstad. They designed, most famously, the Humboldt Park Field House, the Garfield Park Gold Dome Field House. But they were also the architects of choice in Chinatown. They were Norwegian immigrants.
Oh yeah, I remember hearing about these Norwegian guys who like had to
These
learn
Norwegian
how to build
immigrants
pagodas.
Who, they, it's a time when a lot of Chinatowns were reestablishing themselves or establishing themselves and using architecture as a way to try to establish an expectation to the outsider, to the white outsider of, hey, we know what you think China looks like, and we want to make sure you feel comfortable here. And Michelson and Rongstad used terracotta to do that. You get the Poitok Center. This is the Online Merchants Association, which features these pagodas and these swooping hipped roofs. You get buildings with water dragons and dogs and storks and all these characters on them that have their lineage in truth, but are being interpreted in a way to basically create a new vernacular that is expected by the outsider in power.
Yeah. And then I think we can next get into vernacular building types in Chicago.
Well, we've skipped one of the most important materials to Chicago.
Oh, what is that?
That's wood.
Oh,
Wisconsin wood.
Okay.
Wood, Wisconsin, Michigan. Wood is the material that made Chicago possible. As much as I hate to say it, as a brick. But
you have a competing wood tour guy who's hot on your tail.
Well, I joked that my daughter's going to become obsessed with concrete and wood and timber. The timber has always been the enemy with brick. I go and I read old trade publications, and they're always in especially in the post-war years, just shitting on. Can I swear? Just swear?
Yeah,
just shit. Just I feel so wonderful. I get to be on a podcast and ask, "Can I swear?" I love when I hear people do that. They just shit on wood all the time, and it's still a thing. These industry organizations do. But wood and the balloon frame in Chicago, we created this vernacular, this cheap building. This cheap way of building that was totally new, where before you had to have all this craft and these beams and these large pieces of wood fitted together, where Chicago was the first time you could just take a bunch of 2x4s and slap it together and build a city. Yeah. And that's because we had access to all this wood, all this technology to mill it. There's a great quote I came across from the 1940s, a historian writing about old Chicago architecture. He wrote that the forest died in giving birth to the city of Chicago. God. Yeah.
Between that and the city, the Chicago is made of itself. I love these very elemental, biblical kind of Babylonian origins of Chicago.
And that and then the wood was Chicago's downfall. Chicago was known as this ramshackle, slapped together boom town that burnt down because of our own
hubris.
I saw a picture researching today of the first building to go up in Chicago after the fire. The day after, someone put together a wood building in 24 hours.
Exactly. Yeah.
And he also put on the outside of it a slogan that said something like "wife, children, and energy" or something. I love that.
I know the picture you're talking about, and I can't remember what the phrase was either. But something bold and a little strange. Yeah.
So good.
But we can thank the Chicago fire for moving us from wood to brick and changing entirely the look of the city.
Yeah.
In the same way that the Los Angeles earthquake changed the entire look of that city and the way that city has to be built. And now the fires there are going to change the way that city is built and put together.
Yeah.
That's a good segue into our first housing type, the workers' cottage.
The workers' cottage. Yeah. So workers' cottages were built in huge numbers all over the city after the fire. It's a child's drawing of a house.
Yeah, that's what I always say.
Yeah. It's a box with a triangle on top.
It's the most house-shaped house.
It's a very house-shaped house. Ideal. And it can be huge and ornate, but it can also be small and simple. And some were built by developers and tracts. Some of the earliest developer-driven housing in Chicago was by a man, S.E. Gross, in McKinley Park, of these workers' cottages. And then, they were built in these large numbers by developers in those industrial areas to attract people. I just read The Jungle for the first time this year. And in that book, the family buys a workers' cottage shortly after moving in because they want to get out of this rooming house. Yeah. And it's these developers have put up these blocks where, in that case, they're selling them on contract to immigrants. And
$9 a month. I saw that somewhere.
You miss a payment, you're gone, and we move the next one in. But they were also then built, some of them by architects and some of them just as one-offs for workers. That's another thing I love about McKinley Park is you'll see the same type, but they clearly were built at different times by different people as the need arose.
Yeah, they're typically pretty modest. There are some nice ones out there, like the Martin Schnitzius cottage in Lincoln Park. There are pretty ones, but typically like these were thought of at the time as being more working class. They still kind of are in a way.
Yes.
Like unfortunately, they keep getting demolished at a
Yeah.
higher rate than other historic building types.
Well, because they were built in these sort of second ring building areas of Wicker Park and Logan Square and Pilsen, where now we've reversed the moving outwards in rings, and now we're seeing wealth is moving back
Working
inward
back in,
in
neighborhood by
rings,
neighborhood.
and swallowing thing. And the Workers' Cottage is a small building on a parcel that a developer can get a lot more revenue from a different building. And so, they're torn down in huge numbers. But they were, starter homes, more than a starter home. They were an even more affordable starter home.
Yeah. And sometimes people would take them and uproot them. Well, they didn't have plumbing back in the 1870s. Much easier to pick up a building, and you'd shift it to the back of the property, and then you'd build
You build it in front,
something in front of it.
or you would, or you might build at first on the back, and so with the knowledge, I'm going to build, on the front, an apartment that I can rent out, or that we can move in and do a larger home and rent out that back one. But it was so versatile and so changeable in so many ways, because it was built with sort of the bare amount of planning and the knowledge that it's affordable because whoever buys this is going to change it as they see fit.
It's flexible.
It's flexible.
It's cool. Yeah, you could just buy, if you weren't a developer, you could just buy a set of plans for them. And there's these great like newspaper advertisement for workers' cottage plans, and they're half in English, half in German.
Yes,
Of
you
the
see the same
time,
thing
too.
with Polish, or the same thing
Yeah.
with Lithuanian. Yes, all over.
Yeah, and it makes sense of why they are like not always saved. 1.5 stories is rough. People often want more. If you try and squeeze some use out of the upper floor, like it's kind of hard. We had a friend who's living in a workers' cottage in Logan Square, and it's funny when the buildings do still work. Like it was 3 like young artsy girls living there, and so it's funny that this building, like in the 1870s, that could be for a family, like also works for 3 like students.
Well, and that's what I love about Chicago is you get these people coming and going, and the use of the buildings have changed, and the people who are there changed, but the building remains. And they are so usable in different ways. But I think what's also wonderful about Chicago buildings is how much character they have too. I said earlier, not all new stuff is crap, but there are a lot of new. The idea of the totally drywall open interior is not, I think, as appealing or as interesting in a lot of ways. In the way a place that has some of that character in it that can still be flexed and changed.
Yeah.
But there is still good being done today.
Yeah, and then so the next kind of housing type is 2 and 3 flats.
Yeah. So 2 and 3 flats, are, which coming from Minnesota, never something I heard of.
No, the term flat.
The term calling it a flat.
It's funny how it's locked to that, because everyone says like, oh, my new apartment is a 2 flat.
Yes.
No one says my new flat is a 2 flat.
Yeah.
Like, no.
Exactly. It's one of those things similar to grammar school, calling elementary school grammar school.
Very Chicago
Here, I had to figure out. They, people will call them, Pullman style, long and skinny. You enter often into a front living room or maybe into a middle. There's a living room in front. There's kitchen in the back, with then bedrooms that spring off to the sides. And it's called a 2 flat if there's 2, 3 flat if there's 3. You get a 6 flat as well. But it's a great rental, or a family could buy one, and you have multiple generations living in the building.
Yeah, that's what my family did. I grew up in a 2 flat, and my dad had 6 children, and my grandmother lived there, and my mom. So we used every room in the house.
Yeah.
I was even in the basement because there just wasn't enough space. But yeah, to me, it's like surprising that this needs to be explained. The word 2 flat apparently doesn't get used outside of Illinois even.
Yeah. I believe that. It is so specific to this place. Like you say 2 flat, and I know what you're talking about. I can picture it exactly, And interestingly too, like, that we're in a 2 flat. It's got a box front because it's probably from the teens, but across the street is another 2 flat with a very sort of shallow bay because it's probably from around 1900.
Kind of like part of a hexagon or trapezoid.
Yeah,
stuck to the
exactly.
front.
Yeah. A sliced hexagon. But they're both 2 flats, and it's that sort of and it comes down to, I think, like the houses with no names, of how are the rooms given primacy. Where I think a classic 2 flat thing is you come into the living and the dining space.
Yeah.
And that's the place that you're meant to go into. Kitchen is much more utilitarian in the back. You know.
Yeah. An idea I countered this week is that one of the qualities of vernacular architecture and design is that the people who do it typically think it's the only way to do it. It comes naturally. They're not even aware that they're part of the design process. And for me, two flats are like that, where it's like they just seem organic, natural. Like,
Naturally
why would you
occurring.
not do it like that? Because it's a very affordable way to have like multi-unit housing, and it's very good missing middle housing, because like you as a family can rent out one unit and then rent out the other one either to someone you don't know or a family member or something. It's a good way to build wealth.
It's a great way. And I don't know how much it happens anymore. Does your family still own the flat?
No, we don't.
Yeah.
But I mean, this building, the landlord lives in the basement and then rents out the 2 units.
Yeah. I have a buddy who has helped me a lot with research throughout the years. His name's Al. Grew up in Uptown in the 2-flat his great uncle bought in 1916.
Oh, wow.
And he just sold it for the first time ever 2 years ago.
Wow.
You know.
Good record.
I know, right?
Over 100 years.
That, you know, I love a 2-flat. I lived mostly in 2 or 3 flats, and the layout is so perfect to me.
Yeah.
Something I want to mention, there's this cool website called Chicago Vernacular Architecture where they have little models you can build. You can print them out and then like color them in and then make them.
Oh my gosh.
No, they're so cute. I kind of want to make them after this. I want to print them out big.
The 2-flat and 3-flat have kind of been replaced by like the condo building now.
Yeah.
You know?
Some of them like arrive at the form of it.
Yes.
It's funny. The city really wants to like recapture this. Like it's this natural solution that provided affordability. And so they've held recently, this Chicago Architecture Center held a competition. The city held a competition to like reimagine the 2-flat. And my thing is, why does it need so much reimagining? Why do we have all these like real architects like really like holding their heads and like trying to come up with a better solution? Like, I don't know. There's just some tricks you learn, like set the door off to the side, not in the middle. That always helps the layout because you can put a stair on the side and you're not losing windows. Also, Chicago lots are very narrow at 25 feet wide. So like a door in the middle is just not a good choice.
Architects, I love architects. Please talk to me and tell me why you design things the way you do so I can learn more and more.
Yeah.
But historically, architects have always sort of assumed they can save the world, and they have continuously failed. You know, there's just a lot of overthinking, a lot of academizing, I suppose, when, you need to follow more simplicity. What I think our modern vernacular version of the 2-flat is the now sort of much maligned porch front condo building. You know, the boxy condo with 3 big blocky porches that hang off the front.
Yeah.
Where similar to, you know, again, we have these 2-flats here. The 2-flat across the street has the shallow bay window. Well, suddenly some people start putting sunrooms in the front, and okay, now boom, we're opening up. Now we have these big bay windows. That's what people like. Where in the early 2000s, 90s, early 2000s, we weren't, you know, maybe you have a small porch in the back, but then somebody builds this big porch on front, and that becomes
and it
a
takes
selling
off.
thing.
Yeah.
And now boom, 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 boom. And then, you know, we'll see maybe that a lot of people I talk to say, oh, it feels too exposed to, you know, on show.
And then we correct back again.
And we correct back again.
Yeah.
And so it's about sort of developers following what people want.
Yeah.
So developers
It's a natural
drive,
selection.
Yeah. Developers
kind of
drive a
thing.
lot of how this vernacular changes, just as they did with deciding, hey, by moving the door even further to the side, I can open up even more space, and boom, there's your sunroom. That's a great selling point, even if we lose a little bit of lot.
Yeah, it's like vernacular architecture is like evolution, where it learns these lessons and it provides better and better solutions over time. But it's also a very slow process.
Yes.
You have to fully build the place, see if it lives well, and then make a change off of that. Architecture, capital A architecture, as I've been calling it, like moves a lot faster, I feel, in terms of trends and stuff.
Well,
but it misses some things. in those
Developers
jumps.
often do too, where things are not given enough time to evolve and change.
Yeah. So how would something like a 2-flat get built without an architect? I'm sure some listeners are still like, what are you guys talking about? Like they're building buildings without architects. Like, how does that happen? Something I found from an article was they said rather than working with an architect, people would pick 2-flat designs from a plan book or would buy a kit. So like Sears catalogs, that's one way this would happen.
Yeah. Sears catalogs were like plans and materials coming together.
What you could do is buy the plans, it shows up in a boxcar, and you build it. But it's interesting in House with No Names, one of the things he challenges in that is that has become such an easy explanation, but then in reality was actually a quite rare thing that happened. Much more common was a developer picks a bunch of plans out of a thing. You can see that when you pull building permits. You can, people ask me how I do my research. One of the big things is you Google UIC online permit database, and this is online microfilm that you can go through of building permits from 1870 to 1954. And you can see after 1912 is when they start recording architect. You'll see, for example, Ernst Braunscher shows up all the time. And this doesn't mean that Ernst Braunscher is designing all of these individual buildings himself.
He stamped it.
He stamped it. A design builder designed it, and he did. Or his firm, he had a large firm, just had these variations that you could work on, and so you can actually see how these things spread around through the building permits with the same architect. To that point, to continue on Braucher for a second. With that though, he's responsible for a lot of bungalows. He's responsible for a lot of two flats like this one with a boxy front. He's also responsible for, in Brighton Park, two flats that have a Dutch gable, flat front, angled top with an interruption on it. In McKinley Park, he's responsible for these two flats that look like a bungalow that just pooped another floor up underneath it.
Yeah.
Bungaloid.
Bungaloid, exactly. Yes. Credit to my friend Erica, who taught me that one. And those are both very vernacular to those areas specifically. The southwest side, you see that Dutch gabled two flat, you see that bungaloid two flat that you don't, we're in Avondale, you don't see that. You don't see that at all here.
Yeah.
You'll see plenty of two flats designed by Braucher here, but not that. So there is still, with the developer, with the architect, they're responding to whatever that local, hyper-local vernacular is in the historical buildings.
And that's to us a no-name architect. He probably doesn't have a Wikipedia page.
Almost certainly. He's got a section on the Bungalow Association, Chicago Bungalow Association, because he's so prolific.
Oh, I guess we should actually talk about bungalows because they are. Let's talk about the bungalows. So these are like similar to workers' cottages in that they are 1.5 stories, but they have a very low slung roof that hangs over the front entry. The front entry of workers' cottages are pretty exposed when you think about it. A lot of people stick a little like metal.
Overhanging awning. Yeah, the bungalow it's sort of the evolution of that. On my Logan Square tour on Linden Place, which exists as one block behind the train line and what's now the giant Target there. And there's a row of 1908 workers' cottages where they are workers' cottages. They're box with a triangle roof on top, but they also have a bay window. They also have a little more of a porch, and they're a wonderful sort of snapshots.
The missing link.
Yeah, they are.
The evolutionary missing link.
There's a great book all about this, looking specifically at Hammond, Indiana, and how the workers' cottage became the bungalow. And I can't remember the title of the book, but it uses Hammond as this case study where it wasn't a hard shift. It's one became the other, and the vernacular changed bit by bit, year by year. But yeah, the bungalow is defined. It's long. The roof slopes down at all sides. Often there's a dormer sticking out in the top. You've got a big, nice parlor or sunroom in the front. That's a big part of the bungalow, is giving primacy to that parlor. Yeah. And the kitchen is quite small in the back. And that a lot of bungalows, if you when we were looking at buying a house, we toured a lot of bungalows where they've built out the kitchen because it was not given as much focus back then.
Yeah, the bungalow as a vernacular architecture form, it was always intended to be modifiable or have additions. Like the attics weren't finished, the basements weren't finished. They expected you to do that later when you had enough money.
Yeah, exactly. And they were very shallow and very small, not taking up that much space. And again, touring bungalows, you see the infinite different ways people have done that and where they've added staircases and, where they've added doorways. There's a great example of the difference between, I guess we could say, a vernacular bungalow and an architect-designed bungalow, but both of them by the same architect.
Yeah.
In Albany Park, on one side of the street, these two bungalows built in 1918, Axel V. Thiessen was the architect, classic Chicago bungalow. You picture it, there it is. Shallow roof, a little boxy, across the street. 3 years later, he built basically the large custom version of that, where it is 2 stories with this very steep, tall roof for this full space. It's got lots of ornamentation. It's so much more customized. It's got a porte cochere, where that's one that actually Thiessen probably actually did some more careful designing on, versus the ones across the street where those came out of the firm, those came out of a stamp.
Yeah.
But they're still sort of the same form. But one is the more,
Yeah. And in the modern day, if you see a 2-story bungalow, oftentimes there have been additions where it's calling popping the top.
Yeah, it's very controversial, those who choose to pop the top.
It is. Yeah.
Yeah, it's just where you build a second story on it later.
Yeah.
It's funny because I saw something somewhere that said that 2 flats are really just like 2 bungalows stacked on top of each other.
They are.
And so we love those. But popping the top is often not done with the most care and continuity to the original bungalow.
The trouble is what ends up then happening a lot in neighborhoods like this one is people say, well, I could pop the top on a bungalow, or let me just buy a 2-flat and make it into a single family home.
Yeah.
And that's what happens a lot. And now you get what's called the deconverted 2-flat, and that has become its own building type.
Because you can do that by right across Chicago, basically, like zoning wise. Like you don't need to ask anyone to do that. But if you want to go the other direction, you often need to ask someone to do that. Single family to.
You know what I encountered this week too? There are 1-flats in the city. I never heard of this. I don't know if I've ever seen one. But yeah, they look like a 2-flat, but they're just 1 story.
They're just 1 story. Yeah, they've got the same bay window. The best collection of them is K-Town in North Lawndale.
Oh yeah, all the streets start with K's and stuff.
Yeah, the north-south streets are K's, Costner, and Son, and then it's I think between 19th and Cermak, so that's 22nd, and you get blocks of these little shoeboxes, row after row after row after row.
It looks like they just ran out of money, like halfway through. I know it's not the case.
Yeah, it almost does, and you do wonder, did anyone ever consider, or are there examples where somebody did just can pop it up shortly thereafter in a way where they could do it slightly seamlessly, sort of as I hope to do on my own home, except moving backwards.
Yeah. I went to a talk last week at the Institute for Classical Art and Architecture. I love this organization. It's so great. I'm like a dues paying member. But it was 2 architects talking about additions, and they like build additions on homes in Evanston. And it's the act of doing an addition properly is so hard. Yes. You need to unless you can truly mimic all the forms that a building has, like you end up doing just like a wing on something. It feels
that was one of the considerations, we talking with my wife is like, should we, we're talking about paint, should we paint the addition a totally different color, make it clear this is not original, or, one of the things we're doing, is I'm going to reveal I live in a wood house. Really? I don't live in a brick house. I live in a wood house.
Oh my God. You heard it here first on Silent Generation.
It's a wood house that is covered in cement asbestos shingles. And on the side, we're going to continue that same pattern, not using asbestos. But on the back, we played around a lot with, can we make some kind of like gradient of size of these panels or what, to sort of try to make it clear, hey, this is not. Because sometimes I find a lot of additions, if you try to mimic historic materials with modern materials,
it's just too uncanny.
It
looks off. Yeah,
it doesn't look right.
It's that hair there.
And so instead, embrace the fact that it's different.
Yeah. So in this presentation, they talked about how when I was talking about growth rings, I mean less like areas, but I mean that like a church built in the 1870s will then have a 1920s addition to it when they made more money, and then they'll have a 1950s giant school attached to it when all the baby boomers like joined churches and needed to put their kids in school and all that. And so oftentimes the way that big brick and glass school is attached to it is with a glass connection.
Yeah.
Because architects see glass as void. Yeah. And the way to separate 2 forms is to have a void between them.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's another approach to additions.
I was interpreting growth rings more literally, like thinking about the bungalow belt. Like there's a map I'll link in the show notes. People should look at it. But once you hit a certain area of the city, there's like this big arc of them.
Yes.
Yeah. And that's basically, was this place bumping in the 20s?
Was there land available here? And they built so fast and so many. And to bring it back to brick, as I always must, as after my wood reveal, in research for my book, I found this I think a group of 72 bungalows built in Brainerd on the south side, where I pulled the permits and they were built in 4 months.
Wow.
72.
Do not tell my clients that. They're gonna kill me.
This is before OSHA or any,
Oh yeah, of
or
course.
anything
Also
like
didn't have
that.
to do any
I mean, we're
HVAC
about to be
stuff.
after OSHA anyway.
Yeah, that's
so but they're all these brick buildings. But I found them because there was a newspaper announcement about them where I can't remember the developer's name. The architect was Edward McClellan, who again his firm probably just naming this thing, but they noted that each one has been designed unique or something like that. And you go there, and it's the perfect, beautiful Chicago example where, they're all kind of the same building, but no two look alike.
Yeah, you can just swap a few elements out, and instantly it's a different building in your mind.
One might have a box bay, one might have an angled bay, one might have a little arch on it somewhere, and then the colors of brick are different. And so they all look different. They built it so fast in a huge number, but they don't look identical in any way. Yeah. And that's such a classic thing about the Chicago bungalow belt and Chicago vernacular architecture in a way where, I went to Baltimore for the first time in 2021, and it's phenomenal in the way if you just see these rows and rows and rows, and it's overpowering and awful in the way of like you feel full of awe, not in the way of that.
In the old sense.
Because that's the time that they grew there, and that's what they needed. Where here we put more focus on that individuality through brick.
Yeah.
Especially with the bungalow.
In the case of those 72 bungalows, I wonder who is making those like subtle design decisions.
I think you gotta get the homeowner, get someone on contract to buy it as it's being built is what often happens nowadays.
Exactly. Back then, probably not. There wouldn't have been a homeowner when they were building them. Yet.
Yeah, because it's so fast. I imagine it just being like a construction guy being like, I think this will look nice.
This will be the green one.
I mean, I do wonder. I don't know. I know today, a lot of times in brickwork things, the mason will just kind of decide how to make it happen. They'll be given maybe suggest you some guidance. Another favorite example of mine is a development in North Austin at I think it's north and central of 1923, 2 flats, truly all exactly the same structure, but all these different colors of brick. And they all have corbels, which is, the brick steps down, almost like a toothing pattern at the top, at the cornice of the building in a contrasting color brick. And you can really looks like, I'm building this one out of brown brick. I get to the cornice. I walk six buildings down. Let me take 25 bricks
and put it
and
over
go.
there.
Yeah, and you mix and match it, and it works.
Really cool.
And it works perfectly.
Oh my god,
that sounds cool.
It is.
And one quick final note on the forgotten stepchild of all of the Chicago vernacular building types, the Georgian Revival. Pour one out for the Georgian Revival.
The Georgian Revival is very interesting in, I think, American architecture. So the Georgian Revival is looking towards the colonial era and previous, and it's a box. It's a box of a house with a shallow roof, sometimes a chimney right in the middle because you'd have a chimney in the center. And you see it in a lot of post-war suburbs and 30s buildings because it became kind of an acceptable modernism.
Yeah.
It's a way of having the box.
Stripped back classicism in one way, so you get close to modernism.
But you're not living in a fishbowl in a box. And it's also built after Chicago did its huge boom, so the numbers aren't there.
Yeah,
the numbers aren't there.
They're from like the late 30s. It was right as like we're peeking out from the Depression. We're like, all right, we're ready to build
starting
big
to rebuild
tracts of homes again, but they're going to be a little sparse.
And then the war takes over, and by the time we pick back up, we're building ranches.
Yeah,
yeah. When I see this building type, I don't think Chicago. I think Skokie, because that's where I see like because this.
I think that might not be these Georgian Revivals. Are they in Skokie? I picture Oh, they are. Oh, I don't remember.
I don't think of them being in Skokie in huge numbers, but.
Yeah,
I think of like
you just have to go far out.
Yeah. You but not too far out because then you get into
ranches,
70s and 80s. Well, the ranches, and then
in between the bungalow belt and the ranch belt is a very small Georgian belt.
Is the cranch belt, ketchup and ranch. Places like I drove on Oak Park Avenue today to go to photograph the old Mars Candy Factory, and you see a lot of Georgian Revivals in Galewood, in Montclair. See them in like Norwood Park. see them in Chatham. You see them in, these areas that were sort of on the edges, West Pullman, edges of the city in the 30s.
Yeah.
Where there was a lot of, or like, North Beverly, where there was a lot of, developer driven home building as we were starting to rebound from the Depression.
I feel like the developer really does get ridden out of our like understanding of vernacular architecture. Like we picture, I think a lot of people intuitively think that like every street in Chicago is built by moms and pops. And it's like,
it's developers. I mean, developers are an enormous part. And, again, vernacular architecture doesn't end with the Georgian. It continues and continues and continues. And ranches were driven by developers as they saw what returning GIs and these young married couples wanted. And, today the porch front condo is driven by developers and their assumption of what people want. It's
trying to meet that need, that perceived need.
Yeah. And they build in huge numbers until they stop selling, and then they look at maybe what are architects building or what are, mom and pop building, what is nowadays the vernacular, Barnwood, the Shiplap, the Chip and Joanna Gaines.
Yeah.
That's become its own vernacular.
Modern,
That's we don't necessarily see in Chicago. Well, Windy City Rehab. But,
yeah, that's true. They do Pinterestize kind of a lot of places.
It's developers, it's people who want to make an upgrade, and upgrade the kitchen. What are they looking to? And then how do the developers start to respond to that?
Yeah.
Yeah. The next section, you kind of just answered it already. It was like, is there any new vernacular architecture getting built in the city? And I was going to kind of pose the question in two ways. You kind of just answered one way of thinking of it of, just is there architecture being built without architects these days?
Yes. Tons. Yes. Design build firms. And you'll even get a lot of times, you go to Lincoln Park, a lot of the big mansions being built there are not necessarily designed by architects. They're designed by design build firms because they have stock designs that can be customized where you can save a little money on the designing and building for, 3 extra bathrooms or something like that.
Yeah.
And, there are architects still inspire and sometimes drive it, but it is very much developers and
Yeah, working with an architect to design your home.
Yeah.
It's sort of the clientele and the same mentality as going to a boutique store and getting something custom tailored. You need to have a lot of money and also just want to be part of the design process.
Yeah.
No one's going, there are architects people go to and they're like, do whatever you want, I trust you. But that's not common.
No, I always divide our projects, and the ones that we get is some of them are people who want to work with a designer and see their vision. And then we have what I call like custom home clients who just need someone to like figure out how it's going to work. Basically, they know what they want. They want exactly what they had in their other home. And they want this, and they give you everything. And it's like, listen, we're still going to bill you for design time. Like, it's still going to take time to design this, but it's just less of us picking stuff. It's more of us troubleshooting.
It's just the thing with what are new vernaculars, things like the porch front. But I also think the vernacular has become less localized in a lot of ways. It's much more national. Like a new vernacular is it's many different names, the 5/1, or these big block size apartment buildings.
Gentrification block. I hate that term. People use that. Boxy 5/1.
And that comes out of a developer drive to maximize rents out of a plot of land and take advantage of things like if you build a masonry first story, you can build 4 floors of timber up above. And that's cheap. And you have to build to a certain size and get a certain amount of parking in there to make it all work.
The math.
And that's a kind of building that is, especially in this in modern age of air conditioning, of driving, it can sort of fit anywhere in the United States. And it does. And you see that same kind of building all over the place. You get variations. Like I think in Chicago, we see a lot of the take on that's sort of kind of a warehouse modern version of that, or a mixed media version of that, where I see a lot of mixing of brick and metal panels, trying to make these large buildings look like they're maybe actually broken up into smaller pieces, but doing things like large windows, vertical piers, corbelling that you would see on, area like the West Loop, where You'd love to be able to live in the West Loop. You can't afford it. Well, here's a new construction building somewhere else that you can recognize some of that same things in. And you get the localization happens in that way.
Yeah. I think most people, like most listeners, are going to be surprised to learn that most buildings being built in the city are still vernacular architecture because they don't look like it. They don't use vernacular
They don't look like
materials.
It yet. Yeah. They don't, I think to me, they don't look like it yet. A building, a style, something has to get enough distance to be able to be studied and recognized.
Yeah.
It's all too new. It all just looks new. You can't tell what has happened until you have some space from it.
Also, you need that time too for, in 10 years, 20 years from now, for a lay person to be like, I just want to put a new door on it. And then it starts to look more vernacular.
100%. One of the things, like a trailer home is vernacular. That's a vernacular style, a nationwide vernacular style of architecture.
Yeah.
That then made in a factory, but customized by the people who live in it.
Exactly. And over time, it becomes it's a nationwide vernacular that becomes localized as it is adapted to fit the needs of wherever it is. And that can be in a warm climate, people start adding porches. And that could be even more specific in like this section of this trailer park lot. Somebody did this thing, and here's an example that's not related to trailer parks, but is related to on Western Avenue. There's this row of glazed white brick buildings built in 1913, and an architect I know, Kristen Fogarty Yee, her and her husband bought one of them, and the brick was crumbling, and they reclad it in this wonderful gradient of black to white with grays and then blue brick speckled through it. One of the things they did.
I remember that. Yeah.
It's at Charleston and Western. And one of the other things they did is they put on a blue door that's the same color as those bricks.
Yeah.
And then their neighbor did some work and he put on a blue door.
That's
and
how
now
things spread
you've got two. And, someone else on the block does something and they put on a blue door. And so now you have this hyper local of, well, this is where we put on blue doors.
Yeah.
And then do you then run into in 50 years? Well, no. Thank you for applying to remove to city landmarks to remove your blue door, but you can't.
You're actually in the blue door district.
You're in the blue door district.
This is we've had many meetings about this.
In the way that Old Town is, you can't change this anymore because it has to match. It's one of the things. This is a slight non sequitur, so cut this if you see fit. One of the things I find fascinating is like how hazing and rituals begin and become codified. And when I was in college, I was not part of a frat. I was a drama major, but I was part of the underground satirical newspaper. And when I joined, it was like 6 years old. And as part of the initiation, okay, we all make these masks out of paper plates and we meet them in the graveyard and growl out our pseudonyms and do these things. And then I later learned, okay, well, we use paper plates because the first time they ever did this initiation, they were like, well, should we do masks? Yeah, okay. Does anyone I have these paper plates. They use the paper plates.
And then it gets codified. Yeah,
and
that's how it
gets codified and it goes and goes and goes. And now, and who knows now what it's like now, 10, 12 years later. And it's the same with architecture. Same with all design.
Yeah, no, tradition and culture, it usually, like you can identify it when you ask someone, okay, why do you do this? And they can't offer an explicit functional reason. Yeah. It's usually just like it started out that way.
Yeah, at my fraternity, we would, one year this guy decided we should have a Viking dinner where we all eat Cornish game hens with our hands. And then I came back to the fraternity recently and they're like, oh yeah, and we have Viking dinner, of course. I'm like, oh, that's amazing. I was like, yeah, I was at the first one. And they're like, oh, we assumed it was like from the start of the fraternity in the 20s or so. And I'm like, no, keep saying that. That sounds cool. Yeah.
In writing this book, Fire and Clay from the University of Chicago Press out in April 2026, I interviewed a lot of architects, who have designed buildings from the 60s to today. And a lot of the time, I would come in and say like, okay, well, you used on this building in this year, you used this dark brown brick, which is very much of that time. And then you used later glazed brick in the 90s, which is of that time. Like, what was your thought process in that change? And often they'd be like, I didn't really realize I was doing anything different. Yeah. I was just sort of designing. And what the culture that surrounds all of this has changed in such a way where you're just following with it. and you don't necessarily
You're a
realize
fish swimming in the sea.
this is water.
Yeah.
No, I've noticed our at the company I work at, our house style has gotten like warmer in tone over time, and it's not like a noticeable change from one project to the next. It's if you look at projects 3 years apart.
Yes, that's part of what looking at saying you have to wait. You have to be able to look back and see and compare it to what exists now and what existed 10 years, 20 years before it.
Yeah. I don't know if there's like a super good way to tie this in, but I think you're advocating that new construction looks vernacular. It's going to look vernacular with time. I don't agree as much. I think there is sort of a global style to architecture. It doesn't look very regional. We don't have to debate that.
I do think that is true as well, especially in brick. You see it with black brick, gray, black, silver brick.
Yeah.
Where that's what's being put on these big porch front condos.
Yeah.
That's also
Miami or the north side of Chicago. Like it's the same stuff. Yeah.
Or you go to you'll go to like Bronzeville. There's several new small developer driven developments of 2 flats or single family homes. They build 4. They're shaped just like workers' cottages. Black brick on front. Because it's borrowing a little bit of that old vernacular, but it's still using that modern of saying, hey, you know this from magazines. You know what it's like on the inside. Yeah. You know this is an open concept. Yeah. And so there is that, what critic calls it airspace. It's this unifying sanitization, which is
global homogenization. Yeah. Everything looks like an Airbnb kind of stuff.
Yes, exactly. You could be in a coffee shop in Seoul.
We bemoan this a lot on the podcast.
Yeah, especially the fast food one, I imagine. Yeah. So yes, that is also true.
These bricks, they're not being locally sourced. They're not common brick. They're the result of a global supply chain, and these bricks can go anywhere in the world thanks to free trade.
Kind of. With brick, though, it's heavy.
Yeah.
So there's a limit to a point. Yeah. And there's also a limit to its usefulness. When we're talking about brick specifically, where in the United States, all building that's happening, no building that is happening is using brick structurally for the vast majority of the part. There are materials that can do this, structural bricks, and that there's more being used more and more and more, and please use them. But we are a country that uses wood. Mm-hmm. We have so much wood. We have such a legacy of wood, and it's so cheap, and then we build with wood. You go to Europe, and there they have a much longer legacy of brick, and there they still build with brick, structural brick. Mm-hmm. And their vernacular still very much includes brick and local bricks. While now, the bricks being used here, there's no more Chicago common brick being used. It's all face brick, and it still comes from all over the place, including some companies that were doing it in the 1880s. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. You want to know something I thought of asking you on my very first tour? It's a dumb question, but
there's no such thing.
No, it kind of is, because I used to think that new construction, the bricks looked too pristine, so perfect to the point where I wanted to ask you, are they plastic?
Yeah. No,
I've installed them.
Yeah.
I did a building with both real face bricks and thin brick. Thin brick solutions.
Thin brick is it's like a tile. It's made like a brick. It's not. Tile is a super fine pressed material. They're bricks, but part of that is in new construction. It just hasn't been on the building. The edges are all perfect still.
Yeah.
Where in an old building they've weathered. They've also been tuck pointed, oftentimes really poorly, and so they just look older in that way. Where a new building, it just hasn't had that time. And I had been asked that question on tours.
Yeah.
A lot of people will ask me. A lot of times, well, but it's not real, is it? And the answer is, kind of. It depends on your definition. It's a real brick. It's doing the same thing face brick has always done, but it's not holding it up anymore.
Yeah.
But you've probably seen that really interesting diagram where it's the difference between clay and silt and dirt or something like that. It can get very pedantic. Even ceramic artists, tile artists, will work with this material that technically isn't even clay, and then the potters will get mad at them. It's you can get materials that technically aren't clay but do the same thing.
Yeah.
Yes.
Is a brick still a brick if it's not holding a building up? Yeah.
A brick is legally, according to the Federal Trade Commission, not still a brick if it is not made out of clay. According to the Federal Trade Commission, a brick is a clay building unit, and so if you were to sell a brick made of concrete, you have to call it a concrete brick.
masonry unit. Yeah.
You can call it a concrete brick,
Yeah.
but you have to have the modifier on it.
Oh wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting.
And then I have a fun idea I wanted to share. So through my research for this week, I found this cool book, Architecture Without Architects. It was the name of a MoMA exhibition in 1964. But there was this quote I want to read. There is a good deal of irony in the fact that to stave off physical and mental deterioration, the urban dweller periodically escapes his splendidly appointed lair to seek bliss in what he thinks are primitive surroundings, a cabin, a tent, or, if he is less hidebound, a fishing village or a hill town abroad. Despite his mania for mechanical comfort, his chances for finding relaxation hinge on its very absence. And this is something I've actually encountered myself because I'm going to Poland this summer. I was looking at hotel rooms across 4 different cities, and the ones that just looked like white cubes don't look as appealing. I'm like, I don't know how cozy that is. I don't want to go to bed in a room like that. The ones that were in vernacular buildings that have like sloped roofs or like weird irregularities in the floor plan, that's what I gravitated towards. I think there's just like this innate desire for us to not be in something that feels sterile and like too planned, you know?
I agree with that, and I feel the same way. But I also think that there's a great comfort not having to worry about it too. You know, what if the roof drips or something like that? That white cube is appealing to someone. On my own travels, and especially my honeymoon, we stayed in all very old buildings.
Yeah.
But the ability to not kind of have to worry about it. You know, that airspace, a Starbucks looks like a Starbucks, looks like a Starbucks.
Yeah.
That there is someone out there, many people out there, or they wouldn't be building them, that has not been to McDonald's for a while, but sees this new sleek black McDonald's and says, "Oh, let me check it out again." So I think it comes down to personal preference.
Yeah. No, I can see that in a way where my only outside critique of vernacular architecture is just not as much with American vernacular traditions, but across the globe. I don't want bugs biting me while I'm
Amen.
Yeah, so a tightly sealed, a kind of hermetically sealed home is a lot more appealing.
Don't drip on me. Don't the bugs and the rats.
Everybody wants the cottage core until they can start getting inside the cottage.
Yeah, just as long as the windows are able to close at night and mosquitoes don't bite me.
and a fan, please, a fan.
Yeah, so one of the things I want to talk about is like, what can we learn from vernacular architecture? What are people either trying to say or what are they expressing accidentally about their own lives? And so I think the different swings in America, we talked about classicism and stuff, but I think architects go through periods like Frank Lloyd Wright, very inspired by the natural environment, but at that same time, the average person building what we would call a vernacular home was going pretty classical with it. I think it's a very high-minded capital A architecture thing to be inspired by the natural environment. I think everyday folks often want to transcend and forget about the natural environment.
It's like the McMansion. The McMansion is, people want to live there because it is this idea of grandeur and of, aspiration. And the design of it, the decoration speaks to what they want. And it's that lawyer foyer of this place where you come in and you're immediately impressed.
Yeah, I think a lot of the things that people think they mean when they say they like architecture are actually, vernacular building traditions and materials. But there is sometimes this interesting feedback loop where they then start to replicate, things like Louis Sullivan through terracotta and things like that.
Nowadays, we look at that terracotta and see almost the same worth in it as the original. I've been asked, and I haven't been able to find an answer. Like, did people at the time think about it the way we do when we see a sort of poorly made imitation of something today? And I don't know. I have to imagine, almost certainly.
Was it seen as climbing and like faux rich?
Yeah, I think,
stuff?
and because we're human beings and we're judgmental, I think they must have. In the same because we are often the same way today, and so that must have existed then. And so then it again brings me back to the thing of okay, well then let's let that help us reevaluate these things today, knowing that in 50, 60, 70 years they'll probably think about it slightly differently.
Yeah.
I think that, Chicago would hit these kind of peaks of like, lots of Italianate two flats out there from that period. And then I think the like higher classes to differentiate themselves to be like, oh, it's a bit garish to think that you're living in an Italian palazzo, you know?
Yeah.
We're going to do something a little more pared back.
We're going down back to the land, and simple and very simple. And then the famous Chicago modernist architects, Harry Weiss and, Paul Schweiker and these people, I don't know if them specifically, but many, like Keck and Keck, who did the House of Tomorrow at the World's Fair.
I was just there.
They got, Beverly Shores, Indiana. They are now famous for their modern works, but they made their paycheck the 20s and 30s and even into the 40s designing Tudor revivals, classical revivals.
Stuff, yeah.
That's what people were paying for. They designed these groundbreaking modernist homes for family members because that's who was paying for that.
Yeah. I don't know. Did you hear that in the corner?
I did.
So this building needs to get tuck pointed so badly. I've talked to the landlord many times about it, but I've been here for 9 years and it hasn't happened. So that corner is like literally crumbling, and that's what that sound just now was.
Oh my God.
Send me an email. I'll send you recommendations.
We
don't have time on this recording, but there's a lot of really
crazy.
bad.
Have you heard that before?
I heard that many times. No, there was a crack and they sealed it from the inside, but not the outside.
Oh my God.
I told them they should seal it from the outside, but
No one listens to you. Oh man.
There's a lot of really bad tuck pointing that happens out there. That's very cheap. People do it.
Oh yeah, if you do it wrong, we've seen it on tours. If you do it wrong, it like makes the brick erode.
Spalling.
It just because modern mortar is stronger than historic brick, but we can't go down that road today.
We'll be here all night.
You can get mortars that are equivalent to historic mortars. You just have to find them.
Yeah.
Anyway.
But yeah, and then it's the other side of that of like, people building a home that they think is in the classical tradition is like, I think what gets forgotten about when people study vernacular architecture is they just look at vernacular classicism. When really like a lot of times working people, whatever like a specific class they are, see themselves, at post-World War II as part of this like striding forward class of modern people entering a whole new world that's not going to follow the same rules as before.
So there are examples throughout the city of this, like the Davis Theater in Lincoln Square. Like the top of it is clearly terracotta, 1900s, but the bottom it looks so 70s.
Yes.
Yeah. It was like showing like we're not just gonna. It would be rude to let this thing like rot and stay the same. Like we have to renovate and we have to do it in the current style. We're with it.
Well, it's also not that it would be rude. It's that people would stop coming.
Yeah.
I was thinking about that as I drove by a building in downtown Oak Park today. I can't remember the name of the building, but it's a, 1898 beautiful Roman brick, Dutch inspired, up on the top with these stepped things, stepped gables. And then at the corner, it's all covered in, streamlined tiles from the 30s. And then at the next storefront, it's covered in thin sheets of either real or imitation stone from the 80s. Because that's when that section got renovated. And that's, okay, now we need to attract these people. And now somebody's probably wondering how much it's going to cost to take off that stone because it looks too garish. But the tiles, that's sufficiently old enough that that's attractive.
Yeah, we're always afraid of the near past. We love the further past.
We do. But we also want people to come visit places and spend money. And that's why they change them.
Kind of the whole like thesis of the podcast sometimes is like something we talk about how you often reject what your parents liked and you embrace what your grandparents
100%.
Like. So we don't like the 70s stuff. Like, oh no, we want some pre-war stuff.
When one of my favorite examples is when we moved my grandmother out of the house they had lived in for, at that point, like 30 years, but she had this bed frame and it was now the guest bed and this dresser. Amazing mid-century modern, just tremendous. And from that era, vintage. And I was like, well, should we put a tag on this so we know to package? She goes, that blonde wood thing. No, we'll just get me something nice at IKEA. I don't want that. Because that was new to her at some point, is now like, oh, that's old fuddy-duddy.
Yeah.
That's
so funny.
And to us, that's amazing. That's vintage.
Yeah, it's sad to think of people though who lived through like such beautiful periods of time design wise to then not be able to appreciate it or to think like modern IKEA furniture is better. It's not.
That's I'll give Louise a pass. But that's what I try to now as I see new things or recent past things, I try to find the appreciation in them, knowing that, okay, my gut instinct is probably going to be contrarian and and think, oh, to fight, just, same thing politically, fight nostalgia, embrace the moment.
Yeah. No, we often swing wildly between the two. On this, I would say, of like just pure nostalgia. We did an episode about like historical reenactment, and that's like a community that has a very like divided sense of like, what do we like about the past?
Yeah,
like, is it just the clothes? Is it the clothes and a little bit of other stuff?
The power structures?
Yeah.
And that you can, in architecture, you really can run into, you can be talking about a love and appreciation of classical architecture and very quickly run into people who believe that our cities have been destroyed. Modernism destroyed our cities, both culturally and architecturally. And, there was can't remember the name of the subreddit, but there was a subreddit that was all about, new buildings that are designed in, Beaux-Arts style. Stuff like that, where
architectural revival.
Yeah, that's a subreddit. Yeah.
And
those guys get weird.
Yeah, I found it to be a lot of posted like, look what they did to our cities.
Yeah, and it's like, okay, who's they?
Yeah. Who's they and what identity do you think they had? And so I think there's a danger there.
Yeah. It's a shame. People can't just like appreciate beautiful architecture. But all right, so to round it out.
Yeah, to round it out, thank you for coming on. This was a really great episode. Are there things you want to plug? Your book, your tours?
Yeah. So most immediately, my tours. So I give, as I said, 10 different walking tours around the city twice a day, every weekend, once during the week as well. This has become my job, which is insane. And everything's on my website, brickofchicago.com. I'm on Instagram at brickofchicago as well, posting bricks. Today was a terracotta face from Clark Street in Lakeview. Oh, nice. But then long term, so I have for the last 2 years been writing a book on the history of brick architecture in Chicago called Fire and Clay. The subtitle is How Brick Reveals the Hidden History of Chicago. And that's for the University of Chicago Press, which has been an amazing experience. Formalizing a lot of the research, getting to interview a lot of architects and artists and historians and, put it all on paper and, write 96,000 words and feel like, oh no, there's so much more.
Just a corner of it.
I could say. And so that will be out. I just yesterday sent in my responses to the copywriting edits, and then I'll get page edits at some point in the summer. And so that'll be out in April of 2026. Please pre-order it when the time comes. Because if it goes into multiple printings, I maybe make my money back.
That sounds nice.
I know that book will be popular. I work as a librarian at the Chicago Public Library. I'm sure we're going to get some copies of that.
The Chicago Public Library, I owe so much of what the Chicago Public Library does in digitizing and collecting and making material accessible. It has made so much of this possible. And also huge shout out to librarians, this time though at the University of Illinois in Urbana, where they have the full brick and clay record, which was the trade publication from the 1890s until the 1980s, bound in these volumes. And throughout 2023, I would drive 3 hours down there at 5 a.m. and then 3 hours back at 9 p.m. And they would just pull volumes for me so I could page through them and scan them and study them for the book. And so librarians, you're the best.
Oh, thank you.
Amazing.
And you're one of the coolest tours in Chicago. So,
100%.
Vernacular architecture, listeners, you can now analyze your cities at home a bit more than you could before and appreciate, the things that are done by non-architects. And if you visit Chicago, try to come and do a tour with Will. I recommend them.
Definitely.
They're a lot of fun. And again, I try to make them as much as interesting and as exciting as possible. I try to make the tours as interesting and exciting as possible for someone who already knows a lot and for someone who knows absolutely nothing.
That's a hard thing to thread, but yeah,
it is.
I mean, you did it when I was on it. So
it is, but I used to teach. I used to teach middle schoolers how to be honest about their emotions. So, it's
if you can conquer that, you can teach.
It really is. It really is not quite the hardest thing I've ever. And now I've taught a child how to eat as well. So that that compared to that, but I love what I get to do. And again, I think the biggest thing I've learned from doing all this is that there is always good design happening. There's always good architecture happening. You just have to notice it and disabuse yourself of the idea that all the good stuff is past.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.
Ya.